The year is 1348. A ship drifts into the harbor of Marseille, France. No one is steering it. When authorities board the vessel, they find the crew, some dead, some dying, their bodies covered in black swollen masses the size of apples. Within weeks, half the city is dead. Within months, a third of Europe will follow. This is not a story. This is what actually happened. And it would become the single deadliest pandemic in human history. Imagine waking up one morning feeling fine. By afternoon, you have a fever. By evening, painful swellings appear in your neck, armpits, or groin. Hard, black, and agonizing. Within 3 days, you're dead. Now imagine this happening to everyone you know, your parents, your children, your neighbors. The baker who sold you bread yesterday is dead in the street today. The priest who tried to save him is dying beside him. This was the reality for millions of people in the 14th century. And the terrifying part, they had no idea what was killing them, how to stop it, or why God seemed to have abandoned them entirely. The bubonic plague didn't just kill people, it killed the world as they knew it. It erased entire villages from existence. It toppled kingdoms. It shattered faith. It ended the Middle Ages and forced humanity into a new era, not through progress, but through unimaginable loss. Between 1347 and 1353, an estimated 75 to 200 million people died, roughly 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's entire population. In some cities, the death toll reached 60 to 70%. In others, there was no one left to bury the dead. This is the story of the Black Death. And it's all true. The plague didn't begin in Europe. Its origins trace back thousands of years, possibly to Central Asia, where the bacterium Yersinia pestis lived in colonies of rodents. For centuries, the disease existed in these animal populations, occasionally jumping to humans in isolated incidents. But in the early 1300s, something changed. Climate shifts, warfare, and expanding trade routes created the perfect conditions for a pandemic. In the 1330s, an outbreak occurred in China during the Yuan dynasty. Historical Chinese records describe a devastating pestilence that killed millions. While exact death tolls are difficult to verify due to incomplete records, some historians estimate that China's population dropped from around 120 million to 90 million during this period, though not all deaths were necessarily from plague. The disease spread along the Silk Road, carried by merchants, soldiers, and most importantly, by the fleas living on black rats that infested trade caravans. By 1346, the plague had reached the Crimean Peninsula. Here, history records one of the most horrifying incidents of biological warfare ever documented. Mongol forces were besieging the Genoese trading port of Kaffa when plague broke out in their ranks. According to the account of Gabriele de' Musi, a notary who chronicled the event, the Mongols catapulted infected corpses over the city walls, deliberately spreading the disease to their enemies. Whether this was the primary cause of Kaffa's outbreak is debated by historians, but the result is undisputed. Genoese traders fled the city by ship, carrying the plague with them back to Europe. Those ships arrived in October 1347 at the port of Messina in Sicily. Authorities were horrified by what they found. The sailors were dead or dying, covered in mysterious black boils that oozed blood and pus. The ships were ordered to leave, but it was too late. The plague had come ashore. From Sicily, it spread through Italy with terrifying speed. By January 1348, it had reached Pisa and Genoa. By spring, it was in Florence, Venice, and Rome. Italian chroniclers documented the horror in vivid detail. Giovanni Boccaccio, who survived the plague in Florence, wrote in his introduction to the Decameron about bodies piled in the streets, churches overflowing with the dead, and mass graves dug outside city walls where thousands were buried without ceremony. He described how the disease struck suddenly. Healthy people would eat breakfast with their families and have dinner with their ancestors in the afterlife. The symptoms were unmistakable and terrifying. The plague came in 3 forms. The most common was bubonic plague, named for the buboes, swollen, blackened lymph nodes that appeared in the groin, armpits, or neck. These swellings were excruciatingly painful and could grow as large as an egg or an apple. Victims suffered from high fever, chills, vomiting, diarrhea, and extreme weakness. Black patches appeared on the skin as blood vessels burst. Without treatment, bubonic plague killed 40 to 60% of those infected, usually within a week. But there were deadlier forms. Septicemic plague occurred when the bacteria entered the bloodstream directly, causing the skin to turn black from gangrene. This is why it was called the Black Death. This form killed nearly 100% of victims, often within a single day. The third form, pneumonic plague, attacked the lungs. Victims coughed up blood and could spread the disease through respiratory droplets, person to person, without needing flea bites. Pneumonic plague was almost always fatal, killing within 2 to 3 days. From Italy, the plague marched northward with relentless efficiency. It reached France in early 1348, entering through Marseille before spreading to Paris by June. A French physician named Guy de Chauliac, who worked in Avignon, wrote detailed accounts of the plague's progression. He described the terror in the streets, the impossibility of effective treatment, and his own infection. Remarkably, he survived, though most of his colleagues did not. Avignon lost an estimated 50% of its population. In Marseille, death records suggest 57,000 people died in a single month, more than half the city's inhabitants. The disease moved faster than anyone could flee from it. By summer 1348, it had reached Spain, where King Alfonso XI of Castile became one of its most prominent victims, dying during the siege of Gibraltar in March 1350. It swept through Portugal, where Queen Leonor of Aragon died in October 1348, and decimated monasteries and villages alike. England's turn came in June 1348, when a ship carrying infected rats docked in the port of Melcombe in Dorset. Within months, the plague had spread across the country. London was struck particularly hard. The city's population before the plague was approximately 70,000 to 80,000. By the time the pandemic subsided, an estimated 40,000 to 50,000 Londoners had died, more than half the city. The death toll was so overwhelming that normal burial practices collapsed. New emergency cemeteries were established, including East Smithfield, where archaeological evidence shows bodies were buried in organized mass graves, layer upon layer. Parish records from across England tell a devastating story. In some villages, 40 to 70% of the population died. The village of West Thickley in County Durham was completely abandoned. Everyone died or fled. Entire communities simply ceased to exist. The economic and social impact was catastrophic. Fields went unplowed because there was no one to work them. Animals wandered untended. Shops and markets closed. The basic fabric of society began to disintegrate. In Germany, the plague arrived in 1349, and with it came something perhaps equally horrifying: violent scapegoating. Terrified and desperate for someone to blame, many communities turned on Jewish populations, falsely accusing them of poisoning wells to spread the disease. Despite Pope Clement VI issuing papal bulls in 1348 declaring Jews were not responsible and noting that they too were dying from the plague, massacres occurred across German territories. In Strasbourg, in February 1349, approximately 900 Jews were burned alive. In Mainz, thousands were killed. These pogroms occurred in more than 200 communities across Europe. The plague reached Scandinavia by 1349. Ships brought it to Norwegian ports, and from there it spread through the sparse Nordic populations with devastating efficiency. Norway lost an estimated 50 to 60% of its population. Sweden and Denmark suffered similar losses. The economic and political consequences would shape these regions for generations. By 1350, the plague had reached Eastern Europe and Russia. The city of Pskov in Russia experienced such catastrophic losses that chronicles describe entire families dying with no one left to bury them. Churches held mass funerals where dozens were blessed at once. The Orthodox Church lost thousands of priests and monks, creating a spiritual crisis alongside the physical one. So how did people of the 14th century understand what was happening to them? They didn't. Not really. Medical knowledge of the time was based largely on the ancient Greek theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Physicians believed disease was caused by an imbalance of these humors, or by miasma, bad air, or corrupt vapors. When the plague arrived, doctors tried to treat it with these theories in mind. Medical practitioners attempted bloodletting, believing they needed to balance the body's humors. They lanced the buboes, trying to drain the infected material. They prescribed herbs, potions, and prayers. Physicians wore protective clothing. The famous plague doctor costume with the long beaked mask stuffed with herbs and perfumes to ward off bad air didn't become common until later plague outbreaks in the 17th century. But the concept of protecting oneself from miasma was already present. None of it worked. Most doctors who treated plague patients became infected and died themselves. Guy de Chauliac wrote honestly about the medical profession's helplessness. The doctors did not dare to visit the sick for fear of being infected, and when they did visit them, they did little for them and were paid nothing, for all the sick died. In the absence of effective medicine, people turned to religion. This was an era of deep Christian faith, and many believed the plague was divine punishment for humanity's sins. Processions of flagellants roamed from town to town, whipping themselves bloody in public displays of penance. hoping to appease God's wrath. The church organized prayer services and religious ceremonies. Priests heard endless confessions and performed last rites until they too collapsed and died. But for many, the plague shattered religious faith entirely. People watched priests and nuns die just as quickly as sinners. They saw babies and children, the innocent, suffer horribly and die. Churches became morgues. Monasteries became tombs. The Italian poet Petrarch, who lost his beloved Laura to the plague, wrote of the devastation. Will posterity believe that there was a time when, without earthquakes, without wars, without any other visible disaster, not just this or that region, but the whole earth was depopulated? Daily life during the plague was a nightmare. Cities implemented desperate measures to try to stop the spread. Authorities in some places ordered the sick to be sealed inside their homes with their families, essentially condemning the healthy to infection. Venice established some of the first quarantine systems, requiring ships to anchor offshore for 40 days. 40 giorni, the origin of the word quarantine, before docking. But these measures had limited success against a disease whose true method of transmission, fleas on rats, was unknown. The disposal of bodies became an overwhelming crisis. In normal times, burial was a sacred ritual performed with ceremony and respect. During the plague, there was neither time nor manpower for such practices. Mass graves were dug outside city walls. Bodies were collected in carts, sometimes piled in the streets waiting for removal. In some places, the dead were simply thrown into rivers or hastily buried wherever space could be found. An English chronicler wrote, "So great a multitude did not suffice for burying the dead, but men and women carried their own children on their shoulders to the church and threw them into a common pit. From these pits, such a stench emanated that scarcely anyone dared to walk beside the cemeteries. Families were torn apart. Parents died, leaving children orphaned. Children died, leaving parents destroyed by grief. Entire households were wiped out, with no one left to inherit property or carry on family names." The Italian chronicler Agnolo di Tura wrote one of the most heartbreaking accounts from Siena. "I, Agnolo di Tura, called the fat, buried my 5 children with my own hands. And there were also those who were so sparsely covered with earth that the dogs dragged them forth and devoured many bodies throughout the city." Economic collapse followed social collapse. With so many dead, labor became scarce and valuable. Peasants who survived could demand higher wages. The rigid feudal system began to crack. Fields went unplanted, resulting in food shortages. Trade networks that had carried goods across continents were disrupted. Luxury goods became scarce. Basic necessities became expensive. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect was the uncertainty. People didn't know why this was happening, how it spread, or how to protect themselves. They tried everything. Some fled to the countryside, believing cities were more dangerous. Sometimes this worked, often it didn't. Some isolated themselves completely. Others believed the plague couldn't be avoided and lived recklessly, indulging in whatever pleasures remained. Boccaccio described this societal breakdown in the Decameron. Some thought that living moderately and avoiding excess would help a great deal in resisting this disease. Others were of the opinion that to drink excessively, to enjoy life, to go about singing and celebrating, satisfying every appetite they could, laughing and jesting at the whole thing. This was the best medicine. The plague wasn't a single event. It was a recurring nightmare. The first great pandemic lasted from 1347 to 1353, but the plague returned in waves for centuries afterward. Second plague pandemic would strike in 1361 to 62, killing many who had been children during the first outbreak. Additional waves came in 1369, 1374 to 75, 1390, and continued into the 18th century. Major outbreaks occurred in London in 1665, killing approximately 100,000 people. The Great Plague of Marseille in 1720 killed an estimated 100,000 in southern France. But that initial first wave, the Black Death of 1347 to 1353, was the worst. The death toll is difficult to calculate precisely because medieval record-keeping was incomplete and inconsistent, but historians have compiled estimates from various sources. Europe's population before the plague was approximately 75 to 80 million. By 1353, it had fallen to 50 to 55 million. That's 25 to 30 million dead in Europe alone. And these are conservative estimates. Some historians suggest the toll was even higher. Different regions suffered different rates of mortality. Egypt lost approximately 40% of its urban population. The Middle East saw similar devastation, with major cities like Damascus, Aleppo, and Cairo losing significant portions of their inhabitants. In Cairo, contemporary accounts describe 10,000 deaths per day at the plague's height, though this figure is likely exaggerated. Even so, the scale was enormous. The plague didn't respect wealth, power, or status. Kings and queens died alongside peasants. Princess Joan of England, daughter of King Edward III, died of plague in 1348, on her way to marry Peter of Castile. Queen Jeanne de Bourbon of France died of plague in 1378. Archbishop Thomas Bradwardine of Canterbury died days after his appointment in 1349. The famous Italian poet Petrarch lost both his patron, Cardinal Giovanni Colonna, and his beloved Laura to the plague. What finally ended the first wave of the Black Death? Not human intervention. We had no effective treatments or preventive measures. The plague seems to have run its course partly through natural factors. By 1353, it had burned through the susceptible population. Those who survived had either been exposed and developed some immunity, or had genetic advantages we now know affect resistance to the plague. Geographic factors and seasonal changes played roles. The harsh winter of 1349 to 1350 may have reduced flea and rat populations in some areas. But the plague didn't end. It just slowed. It became endemic, reappearing periodically whenever conditions were right. Not until the 18th and 19th centuries did plague outbreaks begin to diminish in Europe, likely due to improvements in sanitation, changes in housing that separated humans from rats, and the replacement of black rats with brown rats that were less efficient plague carriers. The true cause of the Black Death wasn't understood until 1894, when French bacteriologist Alexandre Yersin and Japanese physician Kitasato Shibasaburo independently identified Yersinia pestis as the culprit. The disease is caused by a bacterium that lives in fleas, primarily those parasitizing rodents. When an infected flea bites a human, the bacteria can enter the bloodstream. This simple mechanism, invisible to medieval eyes, killed tens of millions. Modern science has even confirmed the medieval accounts through archaeological evidence. Geneticists have extracted and sequenced Yersinia pestis DNA from dental pulp of plague victims buried in 14th century mass graves across Europe. The genetic analysis proves the same bacterial strain that caused the Black Death is ancestral to most modern strains of plague bacteria. We can trace the disease's spread through these ancient bacterial genomes, confirming the paths described in historical records. The Black Death transformed Europe in profound ways that shaped the modern world. The massive population loss upended the feudal system. With labor scarce, surviving peasants could demand better wages and treatment. When landlords resisted, peasant revolts erupted. The English Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was directly influenced by post-plague social tensions. The rigid social hierarchy of medieval Europe began its long collapse. Economic changes followed. With fewer consumers, demand for goods dropped, but those who survived often inherited wealth from multiple deceased relatives, creating new economic mobility. Some families rose from poverty to prosperity overnight. Traditional power structures weakened. The Catholic Church, which had dominated medieval life, faced a crisis of authority after failing to stop the plague or explain it theologically. Art and literature changed. Pre-plague medieval art focused heavily on religious themes with idealized, serene imagery. Post-plague art became obsessed with death. The dance of death, or danse macabre, became a common motif. Skeletons and corpses dancing with living people of all social classes, reminding viewers that death comes for everyone. Memento mori, remember you will die, became a constant cultural theme. The plague influenced language itself. The word quarantine comes from the Italian quaranta giorni, 40 days. The phrase bless you, after sneezing, may have origins in plague times, when respiratory symptoms were feared as signs of illness. The nursery rhyme, Ring Around the Rosie, is often claimed to be about the plague, though this connection is disputed by historians and folklorists. What lessons did humanity learn from the Black Death? Some were practical. Communities that implemented quarantine measures even without understanding disease transmission saw lower death rates. The concept of public health as a government responsibility began to emerge. Cities improved sanitation, though effective germ theory was still centuries away. But perhaps the deepest lessons were philosophical and cultural. The plague demonstrated human vulnerability on a civilization-wide scale. It showed that catastrophe could arrive without warning and overwhelm every defense. It forced people to confront mortality not as an abstract concept, but as an immediate, visceral reality. And it proved that, when faced with existential crisis, humans are capable of both tremendous cruelty, scapegoating minorities, abandoning the sick, and remarkable compassion. Doctors who treated patients knowing they would likely die, parents who stayed with infected children, communities that tried to help rather than flee. The Black Death raised uncomfortable questions that we still grapple with today. How do we balance individual freedom against public safety during a pandemic? How do we maintain social order when institutions fail? How do we prevent fear from turning into hatred and violence against vulnerable groups? How do we find meaning when suffering seems random and arbitrary? These aren't just historical questions. In 2020, the world faced its most serious pandemic since the Spanish flu of 1918. COVID-19 reminded us that we're still vulnerable to invisible microscopic threats. Yes, modern medicine is vastly superior to medieval treatments. We have antibiotics that can cure plague, vaccines that can prevent disease, and scientific understanding of how pathogens spread. But we're not invulnerable. We still face difficult choices about quarantine and isolation. We still see misinformation and conspiracy theories spread alongside disease. We still struggle with fear, uncertainty, and loss. The difference is knowledge. We understand germ theory. We can see viruses under microscopes. We can sequence genomes and track mutations. We can develop vaccines in months rather than centuries. Medieval people faced the Black Death in complete darkness, with no understanding of what was killing them or how to stop it. We face modern pandemics with the light of science, imperfect, incomplete, but real. The bubonic plague still exists today. Cases occur annually around the world, primarily in parts of Africa, Asia, and the Americas, where the bacteria lives in animal populations. Between 2010 and 2015, the World Health Organization reported 3,248 cases of plague worldwide, with 584 deaths. It's rare, but not extinct. However, modern plague is treatable with antibiotics like streptomycin and doxycycline. With prompt treatment, mortality rates drop to about 10 to 15%. Medieval plague killed 40 to 60% even of those who received the best available care. Archaeological work continues to uncover evidence of the plague's impact. Mass graves are still being discovered and excavated. In 2015, construction workers in London unearthed a plague pit containing the remains of at least 13 individuals. DNA analysis confirmed they died during the Black Death. Each skeleton represents not just a death statistic, but a person, someone with a name, a family, hopes and fears and dreams, all cut short by a bacterium they couldn't see or understand. One particularly haunting discovery was made in the 1990s in East Smithfield, London, where archaeologists excavated a cemetery created specifically for plague victims. The care shown in the burials, bodies arranged respectfully, despite the enormous death toll, suggests that even in the midst of catastrophe, some people tried to maintain dignity and humanity. Not everyone fled. Not everyone abandoned the sick. Some stayed, some tried to help, some buried the dead with gentleness, even when overwhelmed by the scale of death. These details matter because they remind us that statistics represent individual human experiences. When we say 25 million died in Europe, what we mean is 25 million mothers who would never hold their children again. 25 million sons and daughters who never came home. 25 million individual moments of fear, pain, love, and loss. Numbers can numb us to suffering. Stories help us remember these were people. The Black Death was the single deadliest pandemic in human history when measured by the percentage of human population killed. It wasn't the last plague, pandemic, and it wasn't the last time disease threatened civilization. but it was the worst. And the people who lived through it, who watched their world end, who buried their families, who survived against all odds, deserve to be remembered, not just as statistics in a history book, but as humans who endured something almost unimaginable. Looking back across nearly 7 centuries, the Black Death feels both impossibly distant and unsettlingly familiar. The specific details have changed. We have better medicine, better hygiene, better understanding. But the fundamental human experience of facing a pandemic remains recognizable. The fear of infection, the uncertainty about the future, the difficult choices about safety versus normalcy, the exhaustion of crisis that extends not for days or weeks, but for years, the grief of losing people who should have had more time. Medieval Europeans couldn't have imagined our world of antibiotics, vaccines, and electron microscopes, but we can imagine their world of fear, loss, and desperate hope. Across the centuries, that connection remains. We are linked by our shared vulnerability, our shared determination to survive, and our shared humanity. The plague didn't just kill people. It transformed civilization. It ended the Middle Ages and ushered in the Renaissance, partly because the massive death toll created economic and social mobility that would have been impossible under the rigid feudal system. Labor shortages gave workers bargaining power. The church's failure to stop the plague or even explain it challenged religious authority and contributed to an increased interest in secular learning and science. The survivors inherited a wounded world, but one with opportunities for change that had been unthinkable before the plague. This doesn't mean the plague was good or necessary. That's a dangerous and callous reading of history. The suffering was real. The loss was real. The trauma echoed through generations. But humans are remarkably resilient and adaptable. We find ways to rebuild. We find meaning in survival. We learn from catastrophe, even if the lessons take generations to fully understand. Today, plague is curable. The disease that once ended civilizations can now be treated with a course of antibiotics. But that doesn't mean we've conquered death, disease, or the vulnerability that comes with being human. New diseases emerge. Old ones return in new forms. We face antimicrobial resistance. Climate change impacts on disease vectors, and the same challenges of coordinating public health responses across diverse populations that medieval communities faced. What we have that they didn't is knowledge. We understand how disease spreads. We can track outbreaks in real time. We can share information globally in seconds rather than weeks. We have the tools to respond effectively if we choose to use them, if we choose to learn from history, if we choose to remember that the Black Death wasn't just a distant historical event, but a warning about what can happen when microscopic threats meet unprepared populations. The story of the Black Death is ultimately a story about humanity confronting forces beyond our control. It's about fear and courage, cruelty and compassion, collapse and resilience. It's about millions of individual tragedies that collectively reshaped civilization. And it's a reminder that we're still part of nature, still vulnerable to disease, still capable of being brought to our knees by organisms too small to see. But it's also a reminder of human perseverance. After the Black Death killed 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's population, the survivors rebuilt. They had families. They planted fields. They wrote books and painted art and constructed cathedrals. They didn't forget the dead, but they chose to keep living. They chose to hope. That's perhaps the most important lesson from the Black Death. Not that catastrophe is inevitable, and not that we're helpless against disease. We're far from helpless now. The lesson is that humans can endure almost unimaginable suffering and still rebuild, still find reasons to hope, still create beauty and meaning even in the shadow of enormous loss. The Black Death ended more than 650 years ago. The last person who lived through it died centuries ago. But the mass graves remain, uncovered periodically by construction projects and archaeological digs. The genetic signature of Yersinia pestis remains in DNA extracted from medieval skeletons. The historical records remain in archives and libraries, and the lessons remain, waiting for us to remember them. We remember the Black Death not to obsess over death, but to appreciate life, not to live in fear, but to live with awareness of our vulnerability and our interconnectedness, not to despair about what we cannot control, but to take seriously our responsibility to prepare for, prevent, and respond to the crises we can influence. Every person who died in the Black Death died as an individual, not a statistic. They had names,